The reason we're all here today is to be in conversation with the amazing, the just someone I really admire, Gabrielle Claiborne. I'm going to read her official bio, and then she's going to say a few words of her own way of introducing herself. Gabrielle Claiborne is a co-founder and CEO of Transformation Journeys Worldwide, an inclusion training and consulting firm with a transgender focus. She helps cutting-edge organizations position themselves to attract and retain the best talent, foster collaborative working environments, and drive innovation by creating fully trans inclusive cultures. Some of her clients include Home Depot, Sun Life Financial, Bank of America, Royal Bank of Canada, Comcast, Mercedes-Benz, UPS, Kaiser Permanente, Cox Media, Warner Media, New York City Pride, AARP, the Atlanta Hawks, Georgia Tech, and the Center for Disease Control, among others. Gabrielle has been an out and active trans woman since 2010. She served on the executive board of Atlanta Pride for the past 5 years and currently serves as co-chair of the National LGBT Chamber of Commerce, TGNC Inclusion Task Force, as co-chair of the Trans Affairs Committee on the City of Atlanta LGBTQ Memorial Advisory Council, as inclusion chair and secretary of the board of the Out Georgia Business Alliance, as chair of the Out Georgia Business Alliance TGNC 360 Workplace Initiative, and as an advisory board member of Outfront Theater Group. She's super involved in her community, can you tell? It's amazing. In 2020, she published her memoir meets self-help book, Embrace Your Truth, A Journey of Authenticity, which I encourage all of you to purchase. I started reading it. It's so powerful and so moving. In 2019, the Atlanta Business Chronicle acknowledged her as their Diversity and Inclusion Outstanding Voice Award recipient, and she delivered a TEDx talk for Centennial Park Women TEDx, Building Your Courage Muscles. In 2018, Gabrielle received the Georgia Small Business Administration LGBT Small Business Champion Award in recognition of her efforts in advancing LGBT business ownership. In 2015, Gabrielle has chosen as Atlanta's best trans activist, and her work has featured in Forbes in 2018 and Atlanta Business Chronicle in 2017. Transformation Journeys Worldwide was honored to be chosen as the Out Georgia Business Alliance 2018 Small Business of the Year, and to receive the Atlanta Hawks' prestigious 2019 True Comes in All Colors Award for their cutting-edge inclusion work. The firm is proud to be an NGLCC certified LGBT business enterprise. Please welcome in and joining and give a virtual applause for the amazing Gabrielle Claiborne. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Mark, for having me in this conversation. I'm so grateful to be among all of you, and as we talk about some important topics today. So thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you for being here. I am fangirling inside and outside. I'm just such a staunch appreciation for the work you do. And so I'm glad you're here today. Dr. Nika White, our founder and CEO and lead principal consultant, often says, time is the one currency you can't get back. So thank you for spending your time with us today and saying yes to the invitation. It means a lot to all of us.
Sure, thank you for having me.
So please introduce yourself in your own words and say something that we may not be able to learn about you from your bio.
Sure. So my name is Gabrielle Claiborne. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. You read a lot about how I show up in the community. In addition to those things, I am a parent. I am a grandparent. I am a child of parents raised here in the Bible Belt. And 11 years ago, I was encouraged and invited over the course of my life to pay attention to some of the invitations that life had invited me to consider. And that is when I made the courageous step to embrace this aspect of who I am as a transgender woman. And that set me on the course of showing up vulnerably and transparently and authentically in my personal life, in my vocational life, in my spiritual community. Every aspect of my life, it just kind of turned it upside down and invited me to show up in a different way, in a way that was more authentic to me. So yeah, that's kind of how I am, who I am, and how I show up in the world today.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I want to dive into some questions I have for you. There's something I want to talk to you about, but the hour goes by so fast. So I want to make sure I get as much in with you as possible. And then we're going
Sure.
to open up to Q&A with the audience. And I want to encourage everyone to please feel free to type in comments in the chat, use your reaction buttons on Zoom. Feel free to really engage with us throughout the conversation. I would do my best to bring in questions from the audience when the time comes. So if you have your question and you want to write it in the chat now, feel free to do that if so you don't forget. But yeah, let's just have a conversation. Are you ready?
Absolutely. Let's do this.
Awesome. So before we dive into your book, which I'm reading right now, which I really love, and I love the title, Embrace Your Truth, so powerful. Um, you know, A Journey of Authenticity is a subtitle. And
Right.
so can you just share with our community how you define authenticity? Because there's so many different perceptions of that word. How do you define it?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark. And I get this question quite often because, I think all of us have our own understanding of authenticity through our own personal lens, how we show up in the world. And for me, authenticity is embracing my truth fiercely. And when I talk about embracing my truth fiercely, it means for me, what I learned over the course of the last 11 years is that our heart talks to us in 5 different languages, and paying attention to those 5 languages that our hearts speak to us with, and in inviting us to get honest with ourselves, to live in integrity with who we know ourselves to be. So living my life courageously, showing up fiercely, without allowing others' expectations to dictate how I show up. I think a lot of times what keeps us stuck as individuals from living an authentic life is the perceptions of the risk, the perceived risk that we will face, what we might lose if we take those courageous steps to step into our truth, whatever it looks like. It just so happens that one aspect of my truth is that I am a transgender woman, but that is just one aspect of who I am and how I show up as an individual. So I think, we have to recognize that those perceived risks, uh, the things that we might lose in our life, or the form of our relationships may change. The more we step into our authenticity, the better that we
Mm.
can show up in those spaces. I learned a very important lesson early on in my journey. As I was coming out to my family, I had an opportunity to have dinner with my youngest daughter. I've got 3 millennial children, 30, 32, and 34. And my youngest daughter and I were out for dinner, and she made the comment to me. She said, my children call me Da. She said, Da, I can't imagine how happy you are. I'm just, being around you, I'm seeing you more content than I've ever seen you in my life. And what I realized was, when she made that statement to me, is that I can only be as honest and show up for those in my life, whether it's personally, whether it's vocationally, however I show up, to the degree that I'm honest with myself. And that was a very important lesson that I had to learn, that allowed me to step more into my authentic self. So, you know, it was a good thing that I learned the importance of loving myself first, and then allowing myself to show up in integrity, vulnerably, uh, authentically, for those in my life and in all the different places that I show up. So I know that that was probably a long answer to your question about
I
how
love
I
it.
define authenticity, but I'll stop there.
No, I love it. I think something you said that's really powerful is that moment when your child affirmed you and affirmed your
Mm,
happiness.
yes,
And I think, as LGBTQ people, we face so much family rejection, we face so much community rejection. And unfortunately, that's true. But on the other side of that loss is a gain.
yes,
And that gain is our chosen family, our chosen community of members who belong to the community, who really rally behind us and support us. And I love that. I love that your child can say, you look the happiest I've ever seen you.
Yeah.
Because that
Yeah.
to me is a daily choice, right? Authenticity is a daily choice. I wake up every day saying, I'm going to be my authentic self today, no matter the loss, the risk to my well-being,
Right.
because there's a physical threat. We'll talk about that later in the conversation about the violence that the trans community faces
Right.
for living in their truth.
I'll also say something, Mark, and that is, as we show up authentically, what we have to be mindful of is that those who are in our circle of influence, our sphere of influence, we have to give them an opportunity to show up authentically as well. And a lot of times, how we show up authentically impacts how others show up authentically. And one thing that I learned in my journey was as I stepped more into my authenticity, I had to allow those that are around me to step into their own authentic expression, whatever that looked like for them. And for my parents, for my sister, for my children, for my ex-wife, I realized that I had to allow them to travel their own journey around authenticity as it relates to my journey of authenticity, and handle that with grace, hold
Mm,
space for them, and allow them to wrestle with the grief that they had to go through in losing the person, the form of the person that they thought they knew, to this emerging individual that they're now learning more about, as I am honest with myself. So, when we're talking about authenticity, it's not an independent journey that we travel. Authenticity touches everybody around us, and there's different dynamics that you have to learn how to navigate through. And the reality is some folks are going to come back around, and then some folks may say, this just doesn't work for me anymore. And that's when you have to be courageous enough to say and recognize that, that season was that season, and now we're going to move out of that season into a new form or a new season, and to be okay with that. So, authenticity is I often say authenticity is not a destination. Authenticity is a journey.
yes, I love that. It's a great segue into your book, A Journey of Authenticity, right? The subtitle of your book, Embrace Your Truth. I'm still reading it, but it's something that really struck me in the very beginning of the book. Um, and I totally recommend our community to buy a copy. We put a link in the chats, and we'll share that link in our recap email after this conversation today. Um, is that you tell this beautiful story about naming yourself
Yeah.
and the meaning and the intention behind your name. Would you mind sharing that journey with us? The naming of yourself, because so often our names are given to us with no negotiation, no, do you like this name as a child, baby Mark?
Yeah.
No, it's just given to us. But I think the beauty that comes from authenticity and really defining oneself is the ability to rename or name oneself. And so can you share that journey with us?
Absolutely. That's a great question. And this is one of the favorite parts of my book, Mark, because what I've learned in my own journey of authenticity, that there has to be an internal and external alignment that we experience, and that those things have to come in alignment. And when those things come in alignment, that's when we show up as our highest and best and full capacity as human beings. And one of those steps that of alignment that I had to take was uh, choosing and finding a name that worked for me, that actually resonated with me, and actually uh, felt an integrity with myself. It's often said that the power is given to someone who has the control over naming that person, right? And I wanted to take the power from those individuals who named me, excuse me, in my pre-transition persona. By the way, that name worked for me for many years, but as I stepped more into my authenticity, I realized that that name no longer worked for me. And so I started this search of finding the name that worked for me. And I'll never forget the first time I met a mentor of mine who actually allowed me to experience myself authentically for the very first time. One of her pieces of homework was, she says, I want you to find a name that works for you. So this set me on this journey of finding a name that worked for me. And because I came from a very spiritual heritage. My dad is a Pentecostal preacher. In fact, I'm a fourth generation Pentecostal preacher's kid. So I grew up in this very conservative environment. And so I immediately went to the Hebrew language. And while I wanted to find a name that worked for me, I also wanted to honor the name that was given, or the names that was given to me by my birth parents. So I kept the initials of my birth name, GEC. And so I started looking in the Hebrew language for names under G and found Gabrielle. And what Gabrielle is in Hebrew, it's strength of God. And then I looked under E in the Hebrew language for names under E, and I found Elena, and that's light of God. And those names so resonated with my spiritual heritage, how I was raised, and the impact that I wanted to have on the world, the legacy that I wanted to leave, strength and light, and the importance of showing up in your full capacity. And then my mentor, she always told me that, you look fabulous in Liz Claiborne clothes. So, hey, I had to find a C, and Claiborne worked. So that's how I found my name, Gabrielle Elena Claiborne.
I love that. I love that. And I think, yeah, someone just wrote in the chat, until this moment, oh, Dr. Nika White, she said, until this moment, I never thought about the agency and power in the process of naming that transgender people may experience. Thanks for sharing this story, Gabrielle.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's so important, right? It's so important to think about the power, the agency of naming oneself. And I will say, as a gender nonconforming man, Mark Travis Rivera works for me. It's the name I was given at birth. It's the name that works for me. I built a brand, I built a career around that name.
yeah,
And I think, and then you and I talked about this in our prep call, about this idea that for gender nonconforming people, this is a segue into transitioning. And for me, it's not. This
yeah,
is who I am. And I'm proud of that. But I named that because too often non-binary or androgynous people who are queer or gender nonconforming are dismissed as if like who we are now is some transition, like an
right.
in-between moments, and it's not. It's who I am. And so while for some people who are gender nonconforming or non-binary, it can be a segue or a transitional period or, into something else. I never wanted to be a woman. I never wanted to, change my gender identity, but my expression, right? And Audre
Yes,
Lorde, Black feminist warrior poet, Audre Lorde, gave me permission to define my own manhood.
right.
And when she gave me permission in college to define my own manhood, I realized, growing up in a single mother household and machismo culture, um, that there was power in defining oneself for oneself's sake. It was
Yeah,
like I had to tell my mother, you're not losing your only son, you're gaining a better son, a better version of him.
absolutely. Absolutely. And I appreciate you bringing that uniqueness up in our journeys, Mark, because, I often say in our trainings that we offer our clients, when you've heard one trans person's story, you've heard one trans person's story. And there's a beauty to expand in the width, breadth, and depth of how we show up. How I show up doesn't necessarily tell the story of someone like you. And so I think what we have to do as a culture, what we have to do in our workplaces and beyond, is get courageous and have these kind of conversations so that each of us have the opportunity to elevate our personal lived experiences so people can understand the uniquenesses that we travel, the spaces, that how we show up, and that one size doesn't fit all, but that
Mm.
is totally okay. It doesn't make one less or more than the other, right?
Absolutely. And Dr. White just wrote this in the chat. No one population or identity group is a monolith. Get to know as many people's stories as possible.
Yes.
Um, and that's so important, right? But I like to think that by sharing our story and by being a storyteller and sharing our truth, that we're liberating others to do the same.
Absolutely. Yes.
And
I
so
mean,
that's why I really admire you, because you are liberating so many people who were raised in the South, raised in the church. I too grew up in the church, which many people don't realize.
right, right.
And so I say that to say that you are liberating people who grew up like you, who may be struggling to grapple with their truth. By hearing your story, you're liberating someone else. And that is really the power of storytelling.
And that is the power of authenticity, Mark. As
Yes.
all of us show up authentically, we are the invitation. We are giving folks permission to say, oh my goodness, look at this person and look at what they have navigated so courageously and so vulnerably. And what we become is those invitations to others to say, if you can do this, I can do this. Oftentimes when I speak in front of audiences, inevitably someone will come up to me and say, Gabrielle, you're so courageous, I could never do what you did. And I immediately I'm grateful for that comment, but I immediately reach back to that person and I say, do you realize that we all have the same capacity to show up authentically? We just have to take those courageous first steps in the direction of our authenticity. And oftentimes, those first steps are the scariest, the most vulnerable steps. But what I've learned in my own journey is that with each step I take, I get a little stronger, a little more courageous, less stuck, more authentic. And that is an excerpt of my TEDx talk, by the way.
Yes, and we'll drop your text talk in the chat, and we will share in the recap email after this talk today, later this afternoon. And so, something you and I have in common is that we do work around gender equity and inclusion of LGBTQ people. And so, in your work with transformation journeys worldwide, you discuss the importance of gender equity and the inclusion of all women in gender equity work, to include transgender women, gender nonconforming people, and non-binary individuals. What can we do to make sure that we are being truly inclusive in our gender equity work? Because so often gender equity, we think of cis women, we think of cis man, and that's it. We think in the binary system that we've all been accustomed and ingrained to believe in. So how can we make sure that our work is truly inclusive and that gender equity includes all genders?
Mark, I really love this conversation because I'm very passionate about it. Because as a transgender woman, I have found myself in many situations where I am the only transgender woman in the room, right? And so consequently, when we're having the conversations around gender equity, I felt in my own personal experience that I didn't feel like that my experience um, was relevant and was being accounted for. And this came to light recently when I joined a women's group, and they had put together a survey to capture the experiences of women in the organization that they were trying to measure. And when I saw the survey, I didn't see myself in this survey. And when I kind of pushed back on the contents of the survey saying, I just don't see myself in this conversation, a few of the members stood up and said, why do we even need to have this conversation? And quite honestly, I was shocked when I heard that question because, just a few months earlier, I thought I was being selected to be a part of this conversation, to be at the table with this group of sisters, that they were intentionally reaching out to me to expand the width, breadth, and depth of the conversations around gender equity. And immediately I felt like, okay, am I considered an imposter? Do are is the perspectives that I bring to the table, are they valued? So all these questions started coming to my mind, and this is unfortunately often the case for, excuse me, gender diverse women, lesbian women, bisexual women, trans women, intersex women, gender nonconforming women, queer women, LGBTQ plus women. And so this has inspired me to to step more into this space and say, what can we do to expand the conversation to include all women? And, I think a lot of times when we have this conversation, a lot of folks look at equity, especially gender equity, excuse me, from the perspective of a pie. And when we get to that eighth piece of the pie, and that's the last piece, some of us operate under this perspective of lack and say, when that eighth piece of the pie is gone, then I no longer have access, and I no longer uh, my issues no longer matter to the conversation. And so what I love about this conversation is that Nika has provided space for you to show up to elevate not only my story, but your story. She's recognized the value that there's room at the top for everybody. And until we welcome everybody and recognize that when we are, that all of us are not free, that as long as some of us are not free, all of us are not free. So that's why I really lean into this conversation. So some recommendations that I offer folks who are looking to expand this conversation is making sure that you're bringing someone along with you. I have a very good friend and colleague who identifies as a lesbian woman, and she has been a very successful senior executive in a large financial company. And over the course of the last few years, we have worked together, and she has brought me along as a transgender woman in the spaces that she's shown up in. And so when we operate from that perspective that there is more than enough for all of us, and we grab someone's hand and bring them along, we actually elevate their experience. And we've actually put together a presentation on expanding the gender equity conversation to include all women. And the first few times that we did this, we were in front of audiences that had not even met a trans woman. So just by this colleague of mine bringing me along, expanded the awareness, increased the awareness, and exposed them to a lived experience that was different from their own, but very important to the overall conversation. I think another thing that organizations can do is making sure they're intentional in their hiring practices, making sure that they understand the importance of gender neutral language. How do you navigate the hiring practice with an individual who may have misaligned legal documents? These are some of the best practices that we share in our trainings with our clients to set them up for success, to be that employer of choice, if you will. Another thing that organizations can do is you can diversify your speaker slates. When you start having speakers come in to speak at your organization, especially if you have a women's ERG or BRG or affinity group, expand that speaker slate to include gender diverse voices, allow their voices and lived experiences to be elevated, so that it doesn't necessarily normalize our experience, but it highlights our uniquenesses. And when that happens, what people realize, they have this aha experience after hearing personal stories, is that we have more in common than not. So those are just a few recommendations that I would encourage our listeners to lean into.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, you brought up this idea of this scarcity mindset, right? That there's not enough for all of us. So we have to hoard all that we do have. And that's not true. There's more than enough. I often say that marginalized individuals, people who are oppressed at the intersection of multiple identities, are like crabs in a barrel. And rather than knocking each other down to try to get to a top, if we built a ladder with our bodies, we would then get it to the top of the barrel and be free.
Right,
Right. So this idea that if we were to collaborate rather than to antagonize each other, we would be free. And,
right.
and I do want to also echo what you said about Dr. White, about this idea that she did provide the space for someone like me to come into her organization and thrive. And
Absolutely.
I've been very fortunate to have a career over the last 10 plus years. I started kind of young. Uh, I'm only 30, but I started kind of young. And this idea that I never had to choose between being true to myself and hiding who I was in the workplace. And to be employed throughout this pandemic, and to be employed throughout this career of mine is a privilege. Is a privilege I have because so many people like us do not have those opportunities, right? I know friends who have been fired. I know friends who have to do sex work. There's nothing wrong with sex work. I'm not here to shame sex workers. But I know there are people who have no choice but to do that because of their gender identity and because of their gender expression and because of their sexuality. And that's not right. It's not right that, you know, people like us, like you and I, have to choose between authenticity and safety nets,
Yes.
right? It's
Yes.
not fair. And so I think, I want to give credit to Dr. White for hiring me, for taking a chance on me. But also for those who are employers in the room and those who are watching this replay, you too can do that. You too can give opportunity to transgender and non-conforming people and non-binary individuals, intersex people and queer people to say, I don't know much about your community. I don't know much about what you've been through, but it looks like you have the skill sets I need to advance my diversity, equity, and inclusion work, to expand it. And I think, that's really the opportunity there lies to not only diversify, right? Like, I not only am I gender non-conforming, but I'm disabled. And so one of the first things I brought to NWC was our disability justice initiative, right? We brought more disability justice lens with my colleague, Dr. Ashton Chapman. Together, she and I worked to include that into NWC's culture. And that's just one facet of my identity, right? So I'm queer, I'm gender non-conforming, I'm gay, I'm Latinx, I'm disabled, and all these things make me who I am. I am all those things in totality, right? I'm not one over the other. And so what I really admire about you, Gabrielle, is that you are all of who you are, unapologetically so.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you bringing up 2 points, and the first point is the safety conversation. Um, I have to confess that I really feel like that while safety is important in the conversations that we're having, we've got to move beyond safety and we've got to talk about belonging. We have to talk about cultures of belonging. You know, for me to show up into a space and feel safe is one thing, okay? But it does, because a space is safe, doesn't allow me to flourish, thrive, and prosper. It is those cultures of belonging that allows us to step into that space of safety and say, here I am, and you've got all of me. I am showing up, fully, authentically. And I think we need to start leaning into those types of conversations is how we carry our space of safety and translate it into a space of belonging. So our our colleagues, our family members can show up without fear or trepidation, but also show up and say, if you want all of me, here I am, and not feel like that's going to be a threat to anybody around me. So that's the first
Yeah.
thing. The second thing is I love you bringing up the power of intersectionality because to my point earlier, when you've heard one person's story, you've heard one person's story. Intersectionality, I think, invites us to recognize the expansion of humanity. And, I really like the word uniqueness over difference. I know a lot of folks embrace difference, but for me, the conversation around uniqueness allows my intersections to show up in a way that are not threatening to someone else's personal lived experience. And when we approach it from the perspective of uniqueness, it allows us to sit down across the table from one another and have a civil conversation, have a courageous conversation. And I feel like where our culture is today, a very polarized culture that we live in, I think until we get to this point of recognizing those things that are different, unique in each other as connecting points as opposed to separation points, are we going to be able to understand that when something hurts me, it hurts you. And until we start recognizing that in all of us, I feel like we're going to remain in this polarized space. So I wanted to speak to those 2 points. Thank you for bringing those up, Mark.
Yeah, of course. And I wanna go to my last question before we turn to the audience. And I'm gonna
Sure.
invite the audience to unmute themselves and ask their question directly. So Jonathan Hawk, I'll be coming to you next. And it's great to see you, by the way, Jonathan. Nice, thank you for being here. It's always nice to have my Willie P family in the room. So I would be remiss, Gabrielle, if I didn't talk about the violence that the transgender women and gender nonconforming and non-binary people face, in particular Black and Brown trans women.
Yeah.
What can organizations do and members of our community do to help stop violence against Black and Brown trans women?
Thank you for bringing this up because, quite honestly, when we're having conversations around equity, we cannot forget about those who are most marginalized within the marginalized. We have to recognize the disparities within the disparities, and those who experience the inordinate amount of disparities are Black and Brown, trans, gender nonconforming, and non-binary individuals. And so, you know, I had an experience a couple of years ago, Mark, where I was invited to speak at a Transgender Day of Remembrance event here in the Atlanta area. And as a result of that event, I had an opportunity to stand up and share a few words. And the community, the DGNC MB community in the Atlanta area pushed back on that event because they didn't feel like the right voices were being elevated in that conversation. And this was a learning moment for me because, as we know, that Black and Brown, transgender, nonconforming, and non-binary individuals are the ones who are experiencing the most egregious violent acts against them. And so for a white trans woman to get up and share a few words at an event that was meant to memorialize those who had been lost in the community, they felt like the right voices weren't being elevated. And so this gave me an opportunity to learn the importance of, stepping aside and allowing someone else's voice to be elevated. And I think that that's what we need to be mindful of when we're having the conversations around the disparities within the disparities. We need to make sure that those individuals who have the personal lived experience have the opportunity to be seen and heard. That's one thing that we can do. Elevate those stories. The other thing that we can do is in our hiring practices. Oftentimes, and you alluded to this a little earlier, Mark, oftentimes uh, Brown and Black TGNC NB individuals resort to sex work just to survive, just to exist in their life. And consequently, some of those individuals have blemishes on their record. So when they go to get a job, then when they go through the background check process, a lot of times those blemishes on their records show up. And oftentimes, talent acquisition professionals immediately eliminate that candidate from a potential uh, candidate for filling a position. And so I feel like what we need to do is we need to be mindful of these barriers. And when we see something like that come across our desk as talent acquisition professionals or HR professionals, we need to dig a little deeper into that conversation. Don't immediately eliminate that candidate from this position or from this opportunity. Have a courageous conversation with them about the situation so that you can be better informed about why that's showing up so that you can make an informed decision about, is this the right candidate for this position? And oftentimes what I have heard from clients that we worked with is when they choose to take the courageous route and
Mm.
having the conversation with a job applicant who may have a blemish on their record, is they realize that that candidate was the best candidate for the position. So it's these kind of things when you elevate, you be aware of the barriers that the community faces. You push through those barriers. You provide a way around or over those barriers for those individuals to show up. And then we recognize that, this is a very viable, competent, uh, expert community who bring their lived experiences to the conversation. I know in my TGNC 360 work, we have created a advisory committee, and on that advisory committee, we have the width, breadth, and depth of the community represented. And I will tell you, we had a meeting just last night, and the expertise, the perspective that the multiple intersections, these individuals with multiple intersections bring to the conversation, I was just floored. And I think until we're intentional in creating a space for those peaceful people to sit around the table and to be heard and seen, are we going to realize and learn what we don't know that we don't know? So those are just a few examples that I could recommend.
Absolutely. And I think this idea of being intentional is what we strive to do here at NWC, where we thrive to create intentional inclusionists. So I love that word that you use, intentional. I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan to unmute himself and ask this question.
Okay, I typed this in the chat, but I was wondering, as a matter of general discourse, like how do you handle people in your life that you see are not really ready to continue in the same direction that you're going? Like, you seem to have a very solid sense of where you're going in life, and then you start to look around you and you see people who are really not as supportive as you might want to have around you in your daily life. I was just wondering, how do you handle that?
Well, this is one of the things that I talk about in my book, and the importance of holding space for one another. As I briefly alluded to in an earlier comment, I've had to learn to do this with family members. I've had to learn to do this with friends. I've had to learn to do this with colleagues. Some folks, we have to recognize that, those in our life are on their own journey with my authenticity. And a lot of times my authenticity creates changes in their own life, changes they didn't ask for, changes that they were not expecting, changes that completely blindsided them. That was certainly the case with me. But I think I've learned the importance of holding space. And like, for example, with my loved ones, if you ask me, so Gabrielle, where are your kids with you today? My response would be, well, today's answer is going to be different from yesterday's answer, and it's going to be different from tomorrow's answer. Because, as much as this is my journey, it is their journey as well. Some days sometimes it feels like one step forward or two steps forward and one step back. But what I've had to learn is that I've got to love them from a distance. I've got to give them space to travel their own journeys from a distance and allow them to go through what they have to go through. I can be supportive. I can be there for them when they're ready to reengage, if they are ready to reengage. But I have to allow that to unfold, not on my timeline, but on their timeline. And that's a difficult thing to do, especially for those who you love and who mean the world to you. I can tell you one of the most difficult aspects of my journey has been navigating my transition with my family. And so being able to do that has really taught me a very important lesson. I think the other thing that I've had to come to terms with is there is a distinct difference in being selfish and being self-honoring. And I just recently did a talk on this because a lot of times when we embrace a certain aspect of our truth, a lot of times people interpret that as you're being selfish. Look what this is doing to people around you. And so I had to grapple with that for a number of years. And where I landed was that as what I was what I mentioned briefly earlier, what I realized is that I first have to show up for me. When I show up for me, I can then show up for people around me. I need to give myself permission to live in my integrity, to elevate myself, to pay attention to what is important to me. And when I do this for me is not something that I do to hoard over anybody else, to elevate myself above everybody else, but it is to position me to be the best that I can be for those around me. And so I've learned that there is a difference between selfish and self-honoring.
I love that. That was like a big aha moment for me. Being selfish or being self-honoring.
Yeah.
I'm trying not to cry because I have too much makeup on and avoid my makeup, but this idea, this idea, I think I've heard it too. I've been told that you're selfish, you're being selfish, you're being selfish. How dare you do this to your mother? How dare you do this to your whoever? And I said, how is that being selfish?
Right.
Loving myself enough to be myself is why she gave birth to me. It's why she brought me into this world. It's part of my purpose. And so
Absolutely.
it's important to
Yeah.
remember to self-honor yourself. That's so important. I want to amplify a comment that my colleague Christina Gardner wrote in the chat. And she wrote in the chat, thank you so much, Gabrielle. Such an important component of criminal injustice reform abolition is decriminalizing sex work, especially as it impacts Black and Brown trans women. The conversation too often only censors cis women. So I just want to amplify that for Christina. Thank you for putting that in the chat. And if you have other questions, we have about 10 minutes left. So drop your questions in the chat. Dr. Nika White is helping me monitor the chat and get the questions to me. So Brandon, when you're ready to unmute
I
yourself.
think I've got it situated now.
Okay, great.
And so thank you all for this conversation. Each Friday, I look forward to getting a little chicken soup for the soul in these conversations. So thank you all, Dr. White and Mark and Gabrielle. My question was centered around what are your thoughts on having allies be part of affinity groups? I've been having conversations with some folks recently, and they felt very strongly that their affinity group should be 50-50, folks of the identity and 50% folks that don't necessarily express the identity. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. I could share my opinion, but I won't. I want to hear what your thoughts are.
Thank you for that question. The premise of these special groups, right, are for. I think one of the reasons for these groups is to provide a safe space for folks who are in that particular demographic, can show up in a way that they feel comfortable and they feel safe showing up, and even feeling vulnerable showing up. So I feel like that while these spaces are for that purpose, I also feel like that there's value in adding allies to that group, because here's the reality as it relates to my own personal experience. We are a small number per capita as it relates to the overall population. So the things that are important for me, uh, I need someone else advocating for me on my behalf. And so when I know that there's an ally in the room that is an informed ally, and an ally that has done their work, they have educated themselves, and they lean into the difficult conversations, and they position themselves to listen, to hear, and hear to learn, and learn to elevate and advocate. I really feel like there's value in allies showing up in the room. Now, what percentage is the right percentage? I'm not so much hung up on that. I feel like, if there is, for example, an LGBTQ ERG, I feel like that is going to be predominantly those within the LGBTQ community, but I totally want to invite allies into the space for the conversation and to bring their perspectives, because here's the thing, another value of those special groups is to educate. And until we provide space for folks to be educated, we're not going to create the equity that we're wanting to create in the workplaces and in other spaces that we show up. So I'm a proponent of opening the doors to allow allies in the room, because there's multiple benefits in the process. I will say, But when the allies do show up, I really encourage them to spend time listening and learning and allowing the voices in that are designated for that group to show up and be elevated so that it does create that educational moment. Just because an ally is invited into the room, it doesn't give them permission to speak over those others in the group that have that personal lived experience, if you will.
Yeah, beautiful. I want to encourage you. We have a few minutes left, so we have time for one more question. If there's anyone in the group that wants to unmute themselves and ask their question, please feel free to do so. Anyone, don't be shy.
This is a safe space,
Well, I like to call it a brave space, right?
a
So
brave space,
yeah, I love that. I love the idea.
an authentic space.
An authentic space, yes.
So
So, did someone unmute
I was
themselves?
just going to jump in quickly. Thanks.
Yeah.
So first, Mark, thank you. You've done a lovely job of helping to facilitate today's conversation. So thank you so much. And Gabrielle, I'm really pleased that you have accepted our invite. I just want to inquire about what are some of the most effective experiences and strategies that you've seen organizations to engage in to help those that are part of the trans community to feel really embraced and to allow them to stand in their truth. And so I would love just to hear some examples.
Yeah, that's a great question, Nika, and thank you for bringing that up. The approach that we take at Transformation Journeys is a two-pronged approach, and that approach is creating personal cultural competency and organizational cultural competency. You cannot do one without the other. And that is where we put a lot of value in the educational process. A lot, like I said earlier, a lot of folks don't know what they don't know. And until they create spaces for these conversations to take place, do they learn the things that that would actually position them to be an employer of choice? So making sure that you're doing the work, not just in specific areas of your organization, but you're creating a space for the entire conversation to inseminate your entire organization, because that creates that personal cultural competency. A lot of organizations do the work around the organizational piece. They put, they put the policies in place, but when a TGNC MB individual shows up in the workplace, there's not the personal cultural competency in place at the foundational level. So when they hire onto a team and their team members do not know how to interact respectfully with them, it creates this space of it creates an unsafe space and a space that's not belonging for this individual to show up. So personal cultural competency is very important. Organizational cultural competency, looking at your policies, making sure that your policies are gender inclusive. That includes your dress code policies, making sure that your dress code policies work for gender nonconforming and non-binary individuals. And the way you do this is you make your dress codes less gender specific and more attire specific. Making sure that your IT systems are in place to where you can accommodate an individual who may be transitioning in the workplace and may be using a social name instead of a legal name, allowing that, creating systems to allow a social name to show up, even though they have a legal name that hasn't been changed or perhaps may not be changed. Facilities, making sure that you have policies around how facilities are to be used by all of your employees in the workplace, not just your gender diverse colleagues. In your messaging, are you using the terms that are relevant to a TGNC MB individual's personal lived experience? Are you using sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression in your website messaging? Do you have a diversity statement? Does your organization have a diversity statement? And does this demographic and will this demographic see themselves in your diversity statement? And I guess the last thing, and there's many more, but the last thing I'll share with you is that, it's not important just how you show up within the four walls of your organization. It's how you show up outside of your organization. Do you belong to your local LGBTQ Chamber of Commerce? Do you belong to your local Pride organization? Do you volunteer for trans-led, Black trans-led organizations in your community? When you start showing up in the spaces that we live, move, and have our being in, we're going to stand up and take notice that you are showing up in this space for a reason. And that allows us to lean into you a little bit more and be curious about your organization, and perhaps check your organization out to see if you could be a potential employer candidate for us. So that's just a few examples, Nika.
That is so good, and an incredibly powerful way to end with those very practical considerations that I think so many in this community can really gain value from. And so thank you kindly.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And in conclusion, I just want to thank you. Believe it or not, I told you the hour would go by so fast, and it did. Gabrielle, you've been amazing. Thank you for being a guest. Thank you for saying yes. Thank you for being intentional in the work that you do. It makes a difference for so many people who are listening today, who are watching this replay. I want to thank our audience, our community members for being here. Every week you show up and show out, and we appreciate you for being here. Join us next week for another Intentional Conversation VodCast, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Same place, same time. See you there. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.